From Tidal Health Group, this is Health Impressions, where we break down healthcare marketing strategies for consumer brands with industry experts. I'm your host, Brian Cush. Terry, welcome to the show. I think you hold the honor now of actually being our first returning guest, so maybe the jacket will be in the mail. But for those who don't know you, Terry Sun, Chief Strategy Officer at White Rhino, a digital marketing agency that specializes in building trust between brands and consumers, and with a very heavy particular focus in healthcare. But I'd love just in your own words, kind of what does that mean? Give us a kind of overview of your experience and kind of what's bringing us to this conversation today.
Yeah, it's really great to be back, Brian. I remember when you and I first met, and I learned about Tidal, and the thing that really drew me to the work that you all do is thinking about what is the patient's perspective when it comes to somebody searching online, and that's really how at White Rhino we approach things. And me as a strategist, I approach things is really looking at it from the patient perspective. We always talk about how when you're thinking about digital website strategy, we're focused on how do we bring that patient point of view to your digital stakeholder team. You've got compliance and clinical leaders and research and all these different stakeholders. How do we make sure we represent the patient voice in those discussions? And so that's really our focus. We use a lot of psychology and neuroscience is our background. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that today. We're doing some exciting things with how do you actually train AI to be more empathetic and to leverage some of those psychological frameworks. But we do all that to really translate and understand what really drives people to make these critical decisions in their healthcare journeys, what holds them back, and then how do we line up the right communications and digital touch points to make sure that we're actually helping patients move forward in their care journey and getting access to the critical information and resources that they need.
It's a pretty pointed and concise, and yeah, you and I can range in a lot of areas, but I'm curious. Like over the time I've gotten to know you, I think we've kind of waxed and waned about kind of how healthcare can be slow to things, and I think there's an interesting ability now, this teetering point with AI. And I'd be curious as you start to kind of think about focusing it down, where is your kind of front of brain and what's most immediate and valuable in terms of healthcare marketing and utilizing AI?
Yeah, I think to your point that healthcare has been a little bit slow to adopt things. We've done a lot of work with business to business companies and in the consumer space, and healthcare has always trailed behind. But I think this is a prime moment for healthcare marketers. The technology is finally at a point where it's really mature, and we can do some really interesting things when you bring in AI into the equation. That it's actually not bad that healthcare maybe trailed behind. They had some important other things to focus on coming out of COVID, standing up chatbots, things like that, online appointment scheduling, virtual care. And so the fact that they've been maybe behind on the digital front is okay, but now's the opportunity to really kind of seize what's available. And there's a lot of best practices we can take from other industries. And really where I like to focus is on this topic of personalization. There's so much evidence that personalizing a website interaction, and not just your traditional personalization where you say, hey Brian, welcome back, and we know you maybe by name and know some demographic things about you, but really tailoring the conversation to your unique needs, your emotional needs, not just your rational needs. And there's a lot of evidence in other industries that you can increase the ROI of your marketing spend 3 or 4 times or more. And also it makes a better experience for the patient too. So I always talk about it's a win-win for both patients and marketers to be able to personalize web content. And AI is really allowing us to do that in a way we've never been able to do before.
Let's try and double click on kind of the how underneath that. I
Yeah.
think there is such an old school kind of traditional definition of personalization of this like click button, like, are you a consumer? Are you a provider? And like, that's the level of personalization I still think in a lot of people's heads.
Mm-hmm.
And then now coming in this wildly productive and efficient tool that we can focus with AI, how do you think about not getting caught in it just as a speed play of making more efficient what is a different way. Like, how do you explain bringing the deeper value of AI into this strategy now?
Yeah, what's interesting is we used to have to serve static pages when take a brand campaign, maybe you're marketing a service line. Let's say for your pediatric cardiology department, we have a client that works on that. You would have to design one landing page to serve all people, and so we get this long landing page, and then we try to make the call to action, schedule an appointment front and center, and we don't really have the ability to, in that experience engagement with the patient, to slow down and have a conversation with them the way a doctor or a nurse navigator might, because we have to just design one static landing page for everybody. And the beauty of AI is we now have the ability to actually dynamically change all that content on the fly. And that's where we see, now we're a few years away from that being truly generative, but a patient coming in with a certain keyword into that campaign, and knowing, even just knowing if they've already had a fetal echocardiogram or they haven't, you can actually change that whole landing page experience to adapt to their needs.
Is it a different way of like reflecting that back to you, basically saying like addressing your concerns? Because you can think of something as simple as that as, hey, everyone may be coming to try and schedule an appointment that may be the end action that this cohort of users is, but their concerns and questions around them can vary wildly.
Yeah, and not everybody is, well, that's the end point. They're at different stages of their journey, and some of them are not ready, and often never get to the point of being ready to schedule that appointment. If you think about, go back to this fetal echocardiogram. If I'm a busy single mom, or working parent, and I don't have time to take off for this test, I'm not sure if this test is really going to tell me anything that I can change. I may have skepticism about the healthcare system. There's so many factors that prevent me potentially from scheduling that appointment that we all know is the right thing for that patient to have. But how do you help
Mm.
them start to understand? Maybe they're just scared. And so how do you guide them through that? And most traditional healthcare websites and landing pages are not positioned to really help the patient through that emotional journey. And while we're seeing more and more patients go to ChatGPT or out to Google and using AI mode to research health topics, they're also not really guiding patients through that experience. They don't have that soft hand holding that some of these patients need. And it's not that they're not going to schedule an appointment, but they're not ready. So how do we get them ready? How do we make sure they have the information and the emotional support to be able to make that decision for themselves?
Add some more color to that too, in the sense of like double click on that information and then also emotional support. Like, what is it that you're surfacing and where are you pulling it from?
Yeah, again, most traditional websites we're giving patients a lot of definitions, helping them understand what possible diagnoses are, tests, what are symptoms. We're essentially trying to be encyclopedias and dictionaries. A lot of that's now getting solved with generative AI, and those are great questions that I've actually been very impressed with the quality of medical information I get out of ChatGPT. I've researched personal and family health issues with that, and it checks against my healthcare knowledge. Right, been working in healthcare
Mm.
for years, and so all those more informational questions are getting answered. But we're all in healthcare because we know that there's an important mission in healthcare, which is helping these patients deal with a really large amount of uncertainty. When you're diagnosed with a condition, it's you've never dealt with this in your life before. You don't have a process to maybe make these decisions, and how can we really help guide the patient through that? If their informational needs are getting answered by ChatGPT, how does that maybe shift the role of the hospital website to provide more of that emotional support, to give them some reassurance, the way, like I said, like a nurse navigator
Mm.
might say, that's very common to have questions about this procedure. You're not alone, and here's what how other people have approached it. Those are the types of information that I need. I think we all need as humans. We want to understand, how have others dealt with this? How have others like me dealt with this type of situation before? Those are the things that help us reflect on the decision we want to make, and move us forward, and rather than us sort of sit there being kind of paralyzed because we're not quite sure what to do.
Yeah, I'd love to inject this kind of concept of speed now into depth.
Yeah.
That I'm curious what comes to mind when you think about the kind of resulting effect when we have this informational encyclopedia online, but now we're building all these databases, data back personas, and we're able to compress the speed of delivery of that. And that one
Mhm.
example I think you gave is the pediatric that took weeks to build a single landing page to serve a huge, so that kind of funnel is down to one page serving a huge community. So what happens now when that gets inversed and we're having so much personalization at scale and speed?
Yeah, you really are flipping that, right? Like you said, traditionally, you spend a lot of time to get to one point that is kind of generic. It isn't very useful. It's useful to some people, but it's not going to be useful because it's not personal enough. And we're flipping that, where you can have a small input with it. And when I think on the back end, just in before we even put AI powered chatbots and things in front of consumers, there's a lot healthcare marketers can do on their own with AI. You can give AI a few simple inputs in terms of the audience that you're targeting, and you can get a full personalization strategy to cater to all these many different audiences. So we've really flipped. Now we're going from one input to many outputs, instead of many inputs to one small output.
Is there any more color to those inputs that people should be thinking about? What categories of information or prioritization in those inputs?
Yeah, I think the way I'd like to think about it is more the quality of the input, and the context they find. So let's take, for instance, if you want to understand how to personalize a landing page to different audiences, and let's say, again, you're dealing with cardiology in a pediatric space, you could go to ChatGPT and you could ask it, I'm building a landing page. Give me 5 personas that I could target in different ways. That's a very basic level question, and the additional context you put around that is really important. So we're doing a lot to think about and help our clients really train the AI around their brand, around what they already know about these patients and those patient journeys, and give it a little more fine-tuned context so that the quality of that output is better. I find when a lot of people are getting started with AI, they get frustrated because they get a little bit of quality out of it, but they say, like, I could still do this better myself. It's not great, and it's because of the quality of the inputs and the context that's given. But we've had a lot of success when we give it more of a framework, when we give the AI a framework and a mental model to think about, like a psychological framework of what drives and motivates the patient to make a decision to schedule an appointment. When you give it some of that framing, now the AI can be a bit more focused, and it gives more fine-tuned insights. And we've found really, really valuable insights that that's when you get to the point where you put in three or
Mm.
four words and you get an output that's really good quality, that you feel comfortable moving forward to the next step. And so I think that's how I really think about it, is making sure you're giving good context around that one input.
So, way to think about that quality inputs, like, is there a client specific discovery essentially that's happening to really just understand what data they have? Because not every client collects the same
Mhm.
data universally. So, I'm curious if that's kind of the lens of where you're thinking that there isn't a universal answer to the inputs, making them quality. It's a bit of a uniqueness to the client and kind of understanding their brand, what they have collected in some kind of structured or unstructured format.
Yeah, and because we want to make sure that the AI response is generating something that is unique to your brand and is going to that your strategy is going to be reflective of the type of patient experience that you're trying to drive, is reflective of the services that you offer. And so having starting with a good base of who you are as a brand you and not just your services and treatments as a health system, but what is your approach to care? What are your values? What is your involvement and engagement in the community? How do you show up as a brand with patients? So having that context can really make sure that the output is true to you, and it's not just what any other health system could say, but it's specific to your health system.
I'm curious, like further moving down that kind of discovery lens, how does the dynamic or the process of building a website change? I would categorize, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, kind of tradition up to this point has been a little bit more sequential in terms of maybe the discovery, kind of the strategy on the brand side, kind of wireframing, content, kind of design, SEO, is kind of these more sequential kind of down assembly line process. But the heart of what I'm hearing from you is this kind of connective tissue of sources of data and roles compressing. Like, I'm
Yeah,
curious what that
definitely.
means to you now in terms of what the process to discover and develop websites will become.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, traditionally, website, any product or service is a it's a very waterfall approach, and you do all that upfront work, and you have checks and balances along the way to make sure you're still on track before you move to the next step. And we're finding that being turned really upside down, both in terms of you can much more quickly move through any one of those steps. So I can now generate, rather than going out and doing 5 months of research, I can generate the same quality of insights in about 30 minutes, sometimes in 5 minutes, depending on the tool that you're using, and end up with really high quality psychographic personas that would have normally taken me months. So we can shorten each phase, but also we can really more quickly iterate and prototype things. There's a lot that we've been doing with, if people know the term vibe coding, which is essentially working with AI to generate code for you, sometimes not needing to have a developer touch it. It's a whole separate conversation you should
Mm.
have, especially in healthcare, developers who understand security and all those things, checking that code. But what you can use these tools for is you can quickly prototype an idea. We've done this a lot with analytics dashboards. Rather than spending all the time up front to think through what information we want to go into a Looker Studio dashboard, and then making sure all the data connections are there, and then building it, and then getting the final product and thinking like, oh, that's not quite what we wanted, or it's not quite effective. You could now, within 10 minutes, you could prototype a few different dashboards, even based off of real data, to see what you like, what you don't like. And so you can use some of these tools to prototype more quickly and see what's closer to the end product. And I think what's cool about that is it makes these things that feel very intangible early in a discovery process. You know, you kind of have a vision, but you're not quite sure where things are headed. You can more quickly make that end product tangible, and you can make some quicker decisions at the start about what's going to work and what's not going to work. And so it really is conflating the process and making it yeah, much more iterative. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the word I was thinking, and I was going to ask and see if that's a correct characterization. I'm seeing this very iterative, like circular workflow. I mean, just thinking about in the time frame that you said, it could be I think you said 5 months talking about like research and persona building, where there's a little bit of a blind faith of like, what are we
Mhm.
working towards to then hand off to the next kind of responsibility in the project. To the other side of the time was 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So what does that dynamic now look like from the researcher and the strategist, say working with the designer, if we're now getting information 30-minute feedback loops?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. It really shifts how we need to think about doing work. And we've been finding this in as we've run through some of these processes. Traditionally, you also don't really go back to that research. And I think we have the opportunity, and we also need to think about how we're continuously developing and refining personas at every step of the way. So it's not you take an input and then everything else happens, but you're continuously iterating each piece of it. And I think that's what's going to ultimately get us to much better experiences, much better outputs along the way. Yeah.
I'm curious, it may not really be an answer here because we're dealing, but I almost think the opposite now too, of like, do you apply deadlines and limitations? Like, how do you think about, or are you thinking about just this like iteration death spiral?
Yeah, we definitely are shifting to more sprint based approaches, and
Mm,
what you find when you're doing a really AI driven project, when you're really looking at how to use AI to improve a particular process, what we've found is the schedule you and the timeline you establish and the tasks you establish at the start of the project, they're not relevant as you move through. So we even have to think about a high level sprint schedule. You need to have some key milestones that you want to achieve, but you have to be a little bit comfortable with letting things evolve the way that they're going to evolve and not try to over engineer what all the steps are. Traditionally, in that waterfall approach, we needed to understand all the steps in the development process and really plan out each of those steps so that we could meet our schedules. But the way to meet schedules now is to make sure you have a healthy way to iterate and refine and still meet key milestones. But it's definitely a shift in the way that we work, and we're all still figuring it out, right? But starting to recognize those shifts and changes, and being open to exploring new ways of thinking and working will help us, figure that out.
yeah, how are you applying the persona builder or just like the persona research to phases or the entirety of a project? Because I'm curious, you brought something up interesting there. Like traditionally, we'd have these kind of like cliff milestones within a project that piece to the project is done at that
Mm-hmm.
one point, and it moves forward really without ever looking back. So it can only get to a state of whatever information it had at that phase of the project.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like I hear an argument that we're going to become much more iterative in the amount of information we receive. So we have to have some level of flexibility that we're going to discover things that we didn't plan for. I
Mm-hmm.
think is a lot of what I'm hearing. So how do you think about, are you deploying that kind of throughout now the whole process or still segmenting it to phases throughout?
Yeah, I think personas is a really good example, and then maybe I'll extrapolate to how you can think about this for other parts of the process. But the value of personas is to have that patient perspective on what you're creating. And typically, we create the persona up front, we draw some conclusions, and we carry those conclusions forward that patients prefer this or patients behave like this. But even further than that, we typically then say, and because of that, we're going to do this. And we sometimes lose the connection of why we're doing that. The interesting thing about AI is you can train AI, you can train a single AI agent on a particular persona. We call them experts. So what we've been doing is creating experts that represent our different patient personas. Think about it as your traditional persona card, but in an AI model. And then we bring those experts into each step of the process. So if we're reviewing a wireframe, we ask the persona, what do you think about this wireframe? Rather than using those often generalized insights that we may have been getting. And then we get the experts, personas to work together to kind of debate, especially if you're still in a mode where you have to serve up one landing page. Well, how do you pick what's the best way to word a headline on that page, given this variety of input from different personas? You can get them to work together to figure out
Hmm.
what's going to be the best headline that's going to appeal to all of them. So I've been thinking about